Thank you for that introduction. And greetings to all of you from the church in Reno County, Kansas that I go to, Center Amish Mennonite. We greet you in Jesus' name. I am so pleased that all of you are here and that you're taking part in being and developing the kingdom of God here. That you're focusing on your family life and that you're encouraging each other. I was quite pleased with that first hour. And this song is so appropriate to go with that because we believe that Philip Bliss wrote this song right after he heard that his wife and his children were drowned at sea.
Did you say Phyllis Brooks?
It's Philip
You got
Bliss.
No, he wrote the tune, but...
Okay, so it was Horatio Spafford who did that. Thank you. I'm so glad we have a musician among us in the room. A historian and a musician. It's an honor to be here with Bear. So I've been trying to get here for over 4 years already. And the first round, when Verlin called me, I'd already been committed to something else. There was a conflict. And then COVID came and shut the thing down. And then last year, COVID got me. I was prepared to come up here and I got sick. And we decided it wasn't prudent. And so I stayed at home. And I tell you, I've never been that sick in my life. I always got out of bed and I always went to work. But I could work for about a half an hour and then I was exhausted. And I had one of those 8-carton phones and I took it out under the tree by the pond outside my workshop. I'm a mechanic. And I'd lie down on that. Well, first I just lie down on the grass. And I would sweat and be miserable. And I'd sleep and I'd have nightmares. And I'd feel like I was a bag of dry sticks. And I'd turn and they would rattle. And it's a horrible dream. I mean, I wouldn't wish it on my enemy. And then I would wake up and there were ants. And they would be biting me. And I either was like lying on their home and they were trying to get me to move, or else they thought I looked like food. But either way, I learned to put my egg crate foam there and lie on that. And I did that for over 2 weeks. I'd come there and I'd try to do a little book work and try to order something. And I'd give some advice to the other mechanic. And then I would just go out there and would lie there and think about death. And whether I'd ever be well again. You know, we often talk about we are in the land of the living. But really, we're in the land of the dying. We have, in the last 3 years, buried a whole cohort of old people at our church. Just one after the other. It was their time to go. And it's kind of rocked our church because, you know, we used to kind of subcontract our conscience to those people and they'd keep us on the straight and narrow. And now they aren't there anymore. Not that they will answer us. Now their lives are still there and we can refer to that, and that's important. Because we believe that every single person that has ever lived is part of the Church of God. We believe in the resurrection. And so we want to remember the examples and the teaching of those people who are saints, just not walking around with us now. It's a little distressing to think about Berlin. You know, I was looking forward to being here with him. I don't even know him except on the telephone. And so he reminds us that we're living in the land of the dying. So I'm here, this is family week, and all you have families, and I'm so impressed. I don't. I mean, I do, but I'm not married, I don't have children, but I do have 67 nieces and nephews and grandnieces and nephews. And I have 4 brothers and 4 sisters. So I have done diaper duty. I'm the oldest in my family. I do know a little bit about family. I am very pleased to tell you that among those 69, there are 11 who we have adopted into our family. My brother-in-law Trevor says there are 3 important relationships that every single living person has. The first one is physical. Everyone here has a mother and a father, physically. Every one of you has a relationship with your parent or your child that is legal. The basic requirements that are expected of you as a child, as a parent. And then there is a moral responsibility as well. And I'm hoping that I'm getting water soon because I'm feeling kind of dry. I'll wait. I won't say anything important while you're gone. So there's choice in every one of these things. And it does not matter whether you are adopted or not. Your physical parent has to choose to be your moral parent. And you can choose not to be that. Now, it's a little more obvious when you adopt someone who is not your biological child, that you have made that decision and you publicly affirm you will be the moral parent, will have that responsibility. But it's helpful to think about that. And I just love my adopted nieces and nephews and grandnieces and nephews, and they are so smart. Alex just loves to, you know how it is. We make judgments and we see, that those people aren't biologically related. And that people will look at that. And Alex will come up to say, and she'll be preemptive, and she'll say, I'm adopted, and I turned out all right. Yeah, she gets you before you can even think it sometimes. I like that. She's a smart niece. And Trevor has a talk about adoption, and he says, Jesus was adopted, and he turned out all right. So we sometimes forget about that. And I want to point out, too, that Israel in the Old Testament had provision for adoption. It wasn't just a clan-based God that Israel served. It was a God for all the nations. And if you were an Edomite, or you were a Hittite, or some Canaanite, you could choose to come and be part of the people of God. And you would be welcomed, and you would become part of that important stream of worship and of service. I feel like I'm preaching. This is not what I'm here to do. Eli B. Helmuth died on the 6th of August, 2000. Eli B. Helmuth is who died. You just keep reminding me if I'm not speaking out loud enough. Now, Eli holds a record that I hope none of you ever break. And it was with Hospice Care of Reno County. He was with Hospice Care for 25 years. Hospice care is for end-of-life help. Eli died of complications from multiple sclerosis. And the way I understand it, it's basically your brain has a membrane covering it, the cortex, and for some reason we don't understand, soars develop on that cortex. And wherever the sore is, whatever that part of your brain does, can't work right anymore. Now, Eli was a simple man. What he wanted to be a dairy farmer. He wanted to milk his cows. He wanted to plow his fields. And he wanted to provide for his family. Thank you. And he did that. And when he was young, he'd get up early and he'd go out and milk the cows and he'd do all this stuff. And he took great delight in that. He wasn't complicated. He wasn't well spoken. He couldn't read well. But he could do that work and be part of the church, and he was content. Well, it all started. I asked his son Willard one day, what was the first thing that made you know? And he said, well, he would stumble sometimes on little steps. And he noticed they couldn't lift the bucket of milk to dump it into the tank like he used to. And then later on, he started getting confused and forgetful. And after a while, he couldn't drive a car anymore because he'd forget where he was going. When I came to Reno County in 1984, Eli couldn't walk at all anymore. He was in church a few times on a wheelchair. And then he couldn't come to church anymore because he would kind of writhe and thrash and he would say things that were inappropriate for church. In his house, they put railings around the edge of the wall. And for a while, before he totally couldn't walk, he could get himself out of bed with some handles and he could grab those railings and work his way out down the hall to the bathroom, or down the hall to his chair, his lazy boy, and he could sit on that with great effort. But soon he couldn't do that, and the hospice people would help his wife lift him out of his bed and get him out into his lazy boy, and that's where he spent his days. And he could look out over there through the window, and he could see a tractor go by on the little gravel road. And he'd wonder what that farmer was doing. And he could look over here and he could see some cows out in the pasture. And he would wish he could do those things. But he was not complicated and he didn't read. And there he was, year after year, dying by millimeters. You will like that, millimeters. You Canadian. I came back from university in 1984, and the church wanted to affirm me and give me responsibilities, but they were concerned because they knew that sometimes people go off to university and they lose their way. So they assigned me a Sunday school class. And it wasn't just any class, it was the one up in the Amen corner. And it had all the oldest men in it. And I think they were thinking, you know, you can't possibly lead them astray. Yeah, that's what they were thinking. And I remember getting my first assignment, and I got the little sheet in my mailbox in church, and it had a list of the names. And the very first name was misspelled. It was C-H-R-I-S-E. And it just struck me. I was like, how nice. Christ is assigned to my Sunday school. Well, Chris was the last of that first class to die. So it was Chris Yoder, Alvin Yoder, Fred Mast, Perry Miller, Fred Nisley, Melvin Nisley, Edwin Miller, Menno Nisley, Melvin Yoder, Henry Miller, Enos Miller were in my class, and every one of them has died. And I have helped bury them. We're living in the land of the dying. I was so enthused. I was an eager beaver teacher. I would get a whole page full of important things to say to these old grandpas. And they were so patient with me. And I wanted them to talk. You know, I wasn't the kind that just wanted to talk and talk, but I talked too much. You know, a good teacher in Sunday school doesn't say more than 30% of the words. I didn't learn that right away. They were helpful with me. And you know, back then, Wycliffe was working on Pennsylvania German translation of the Bible. And I got one of the first copies of the New Testament in Pennsylvania German. And I was so excited. I taught myself how to read it. And the way you do it is you just sound out the words and then you hear your voice. And because I knew Pennsylvania German really well, but I'd never read it, I'd hear the words and then I'd know what they meant. And that way pretty soon you get used to the spellings. And because it's familiar territory, it's pretty easy to pick it up. And I had an inspiration from God. I realized that every one of my Sunday school students, their mother tongue was Pennsylvania German. So I brought my New Testament, and I several times read the whole lesson in Pennsylvania German to them. And they, I'm not sure what they thought, they were somewhat amused, and I think also somewhat edified. Well, the way this ties in with Eli B. Helmer is, after he couldn't come to church anymore, the men's Sunday school classes would take turns to go the mile down the road and have Sunday school around Eli B.'s lazy boy with him in it. And we'd take our turn. And he'd be all reclined out there and kind of sunk in so he couldn't thrash out of there if something happened. And we'd sit around in a circle and we would sing and we would pray and we would read the lesson and we would discuss. And you never knew for sure if Eli was getting any good thing out of that. We just trusted God and believed that it was a good thing. He would be there and we'd be talking or whatever, and he might say, "Oh, I had some cornflakes for breakfast this morning," in Pennsylvania German. Or maybe he'd writhe around and say, "That was some far we had last night." And then one of the old guys would tell me afterwards, when he was a young man, he escaped from their burning house. When, he woke up at night and their house was burning and he got out and it was traumatizing. And it was coming out right then. We didn't know what was going on with him and how he related to us. But the Sunday came when it was our turn to go. And I brought my Pennsylvania German New Testament. And the lesson was about the sower going out to sow the seed. And how some fell on the path and were devoured by birds, and some fell among thorns and were choked, and some in stony ground, and others on good ground. And I was reminded that in the Amish church service, which would have been where Eli B. grew up, that passage would have been read every single year in the springtime when you sowed your crops. And so there we were in our circle. He was right beside me here, and I was reading very intently the lesson in Pennsylvania German about the sower, trying to enunciate clearly so the people in the E and F benches could hear. And not looking anywhere. And so I was going through that, and I was about 2/3 through, and I thought, I gotta see, because no noises were coming from Eli B. So I just stopped, and I looked over. He was holding perfectly still, and his flaily hands were just lying on his belly. And there were tears running out of each eye, down his cheeks. He may not have been a wise man by many people's estimation. He didn't read much, and he didn't speak well, but he taught me one of the most important lessons of my educational career. His mother tongue went through all the horrible, evil things that were going on in the cortex of his brain, and that terrible, grinding illness that he had, and went right down into his heart. And it resonated with him, and it brought him back to a place of deep encouragement and connection with the God of his fathers. I understood why we go to so much trouble with All Nations or with Wycliffe to develop an alphabet, a language, and written language, and we translate with great care the scriptures so that people can read them in their mother tongue. I used to say, why not just get them to learn English, or whatever trade language they had, and let them learn the things of God that way. I was all about the head business, right? But what I learned is God wants relationships with us. That's the essence of God being our Father, Abba, our Daddy. And we do that through our heart language. And we get right into that place. And it is powerful, it is stronger than brute force, it is stronger than all the other strengths that we can think of in this world. So that's the lesson that Eli taught me and that I give to you. We think, I really enjoyed Eric's talk here about how do we discern. And I have, well, last week I heard a little bitty story about Moses the Ethiopian who lived in the 4th century. And he was a notorious thief. And he had a band of 70 thieves that went with him. And he was very strong. And people were terrified of him. And if he was coming, they often would hide and just let him take whatever he wanted because they knew he would kill them if he resisted. Well, one day, he became convicted by God of his evil ways through some brave Christian who said, "You're doing wrong." And he decided the best thing for him to do was to go out in the desert and live in what we might call a monastery now, and spend his life in repentance and prayer and in worship of God. And one of the important things that he taught after he had converted all 70 of his thieving friends, he taught the brothers out in that community, he said, don't wait for God to speak to you from the sky if there are teachers in your life. Listen to your teachers. So that's what Eric was telling us, really. That was one aspect of it. Eli B., I count among one of the important teachers in my life. Don't discount those people. Everybody has something important to teach you. If you've got something you want to say or ask, I'll just pause between things and give you a chance to do that. stories. There aren't that many root stories. There are people who study this. I need to stay close, don't I? Bear, are you falling asleep?
You know, even though you're talking, it's still hard to hear. I'm going deaf, so I guess you can't do anything about it.
We're going to move you up to the A bench.
It still won't work, LeRoy.
It won't.
No.
When I have students, I tell them, you know how you get your grade? I don't decide how you get your grade. You decide how you get your grade. The A students sit on the front bench. The B students sit on the second. The C on the third. D on the fourth. All the way back to F. You decide this. And I notice that Bear is sitting on the F bench. So I'm trying to have sympathy and empathy for you.
LeRoy, your voice drops once in a while when you're talking, so it's hard for me to, I mean, I get some stuff, but not.
You don't get everything.
No.
I'm going to eat the mic. I'm going to try harder. I criticize some of our ministers too for that, so it's fair. Thank you for bringing that up. You know what you can do, Bear? Just raise your hand and I'll see it if I'm doing that, all right?
All right.
And then I'll, without interrupting myself.
I'm embarrassed in front of all these people.
You know, shame and arrogance are two evil things that get in the way of us speaking the truth to each other and of us doing what God wants us to. It's like two sides of the same coin. We're thinking too much about ourselves. I'm not doing this to point you out there at all. It's all of our problem. If you want to speak in public, if you want to speak to children, recognize that and get rid of your shame and your arrogance and focus on the story that needs to be told. So, stories have been told over and over again because the architecture of our minds and our memories, it just works when we have narratives with images that can be remembered. When Jesus taught, he didn't say, now Peter, get out your wax tablet and point A, Roman numeral 1, point 1, and subpoint A, go out and make fishers of men. He didn't do that. And he is a good lesson in being a good teacher. He said, a sower went forth to sow. He said, a woman hid a coin and 5 measures of meal. He said, render unto Caesar, and somebody showed him a coin. These are images of things that we can remember. And we do well when we have an important thing to say, to do that teaching with a story. Now the stories vary in that people put different clothes on a story. That has been told over and over again. The story I've got next is like that. It comes in many different clothes, but it is told, the root story is told in every civilization we know. And it's called, I call mine, The Wise Shoemaker. Now Yassi lived in the village of Studena in Hungary. It was over 150 years ago. And he was a happy but very poor shoemaker. And every day he'd get up early, he would eat his little breakfast, and he'd walk down the path to his shop, and he would repair and build shoes. You know now, if you break your shoes, or if your shoes tear up, what do you do with them? You throw them away into the garbage, you recycle them, or just landfill them, and you go down to Walmart and you buy another pair of shoes. Well, they did not have Walmart in Studena at that time. You had to make your stuff, and he was really good at it, and people came from the whole village to have their shoes repaired, even from villages a little bit further out. But not only was he a successful shoe repairer, cobbler, but he also was a wise man. So he would give good advice to people. And people would come gladly to him because he'd fix their shoes and he'd give them good advice. And people would come with their problems and they'd say, Yossi, I have a problem. This one woman came, she said, the butcher's son wants to marry my daughter. And Yossi, he had a long beard and he stroked it and he said, well, what's the matter with that? Marriage is good. And she said, yeah, but everybody knows he's blind in one eye and he can't see out of the other. Yossi thought about it a second and he said, you know, your daughter isn't that much to look at. This is a good match. Embrace it. It was a wise man. Word got out, and people would stop in, even wealthy people from all the way down in Budapest with carriage and horses would stop and come in and just listen a while. And maybe say something to him and they'd leave again. You know, it was kind of fashionable to go see what Yossi would say next. That's how Samuel heard about Yossi. Now Samuel lived in Budapest, the capital, and he was a merchant. He bought low and he sold high. And he was a very successful merchant. His women in his house wore the finest clothes. They lived in the best looking house of any merchant's house in all of Budapest. And not only that, Yossi's belly was the largest belly of any merchant in Budapest. He was very pleased and very successful. When he heard about Yossi, he went right to his writing desk and he wrote him a letter and he said, Dear Yossi, I have heard about your wisdom and your teaching ability, and I also am a man who loves wisdom, and I invite you to my daughter's wedding. You would be an honored guest, and we would be honored to have you. And he mailed it off, and when Yossi got the letter, he almost never got any mail. He opened it up and read it, and he was so excited. He'd never been to Budapest. He'd always wanted to go. That he closed his shop, and he went home, and he read the letter to his wife. And his wife listened to it, and she said, Yossi, you don't have nice enough clothes to wear to a wedding in Budapest. Those people are fancy. Yossi said, wife, just because a billy goat has a long beard, that does not make him a rabbi. I will wear the best clothes I have, and it will be good enough for wherever I am going. She said, I don't know about that, and she went back to her sweeping. And Yossi did not pay much attention to her warning. When the morning came, he got up early, put on his best clothes, got into the little carriage that went down to Budapest, and went rattling down the corduroy road. He didn't mind or notice because he was so excited, like that 10-year-old. Finally, he was going to Budapest. And when he arrived, it was far more amazing than he had even imagined. The houses were 3 stories tall, and they were painted different colors. And there were window boxes with flowers growing in them. Imagine that. Everybody walking around outdoors had clothes on more beautiful and more amazing than he'd ever seen in his life. And he was admiring, there were carved stone lions standing on their hind legs. Ah! And there was this beautiful arched stone bridge going across the river Neva. He'd never seen anything so amazing. And he was rubbernecking everything and walking and not noticing where he was going when he tripped on a little hole in the pavement and he fell down into some mud. And when he got up, he realized he'd torn his best white shirt. And he had mud all the way down over his trousers. And he looked at himself and he said, "What would my wife say if she saw me now?" And then he dismissed that thought and he said, "It will be fine. I'll explain to Samuel." And he hurried off towards Samuel's house. At Samuel's house, Samuel was standing outside the door welcoming all of his fine guests. "How do you do? So nice to see you. Walk right on in." And he looked out and he saw coming down his street what looked like a beggar in torn, muddy clothes. And when Yossi came close to him, before he could even open his mouth and say one word, Samuel got him by the shoulders and he said, "Now look here. Today is my daughter's wedding, and not only that, I'm expecting one of the wisest men in all the land to arrive, and I do not want him to see a beggar on my steps. Please get out of here." And he turned Yossi around and shoved him out into the street and said, "Be gone." Now Yossi said to himself, "So, this is the man who says he loves wisdom. I think we should teach him a lesson." And he hurried off to the house of a nobleman who'd been at his shop just the week before and left his card. He knocked on the door, explained the situation, and the nobleman said, "Come on in," and opened his beautiful wardrobe and said, "Help yourself." So Yossi got out of his muddy, torn clothes, and the first thing he selected was a pair of purple velvet pants. I mean, if you're going to be fancy, go the whole way to the hilt. There was an Italian shirt, a white one with those big ruffles all the way down the front. Oh boy. He got the brightest, bluest, royalest bluest suit coat in the whole closet. It had gold and silver embroidery around the edges. And a pair of beautiful brown riding boots made by a very good cobbler, he could tell, went all the way up to his knees. One of those black stovepipe hats that stick way up and are very impressive. And then the nobleman said, "Here, you gotta have a walking stick," and gave him his mahogany stick, the one with that beautiful gold orb on the top of it. Yossi couldn't help himself. He looked in the mirror and he was like, "This is pretty swanky." And he headed back to Samuel's house. And this time, Samuel looked out and he saw him coming and he's like, "That must be Yossi. Look at those clothes. I knew he was a wise man." And he welcomed him warmly, and in they went, and the wedding took place. And as soon as it was over, there was a huge and a beautiful reception. Yossi sat in a seat of honor on one side of the bride and groom. And Samuel sat on the other side. And people were like, "Who is that man? Oh, he's the wise shoemaker. He might tell a story." Well, the first thing that happened in that wedding reception was everybody stood up, and they all had little glasses of wine. They weren't Mennonites. They were Jewish. It was okay. They held them up, and Samuel made a toast. And the toast is a little blessing. He said, "To the bride and grooms, health and happiness." And everyone there said, "Hear, hear," or "Amen." And everybody drank their little glass of wine. Everyone, that is, except Yossi. He just stood there holding his glass of wine and smiling. And people all looked at him and said, oh, I was going to say something. Shh. But Yossi didn't say anything. You know what he did? He reached down, he pulled out his purple velvet breeches, and he poured the wine in there. Did you see that? Oh my. But he was a wise shoemaker, so nobody really said anything. And they sat down, and the first course was chicken noodle soup with all the good spices that those Hungarians put in there. They put paprika on everything, and it's good. You know what he did with his soup? He sat down on his chair properly, and he pulled one of those brown riding boots off his foot, and he dumped the soup in there, swished it around, and stuck his foot back in there. It was disgusting. And he did that with everything as it came by. He had cooked carrots smeared up one sleeve of that royal blue, brocaded soup coat. And he had sauerkraut smeared down the other. He put his piece of chicken paprishka into the pocket. When the cooked peas came around, he took his big top hat off, and he forked some peas in there and put it back on his head. Now there were two little boys with little top hats in that crowd, and they realized that that was one of the wisest things they'd ever seen done with cooked peas. And when their turn came, they took their little hats off and they forked their peas in there, because Yossi did it, until their mother saw them. And she leaned over and whispered a vicious whisper, and she said, "You are not the wise shoemaker. Eat your peas." And because she was closer to them, and they had the fear of their mother in their hearts, they listened. People were not at ease with this. This was not normal activity for a wedding reception. And it was awkward. And it was time for dessert. And the cooks came in, and they were not skinny cooks, so they could be trusted. And they had an enormous platter of Apfelstrudel. It was the most beautiful Apfelstrudel anyone had ever seen. And everybody thought about Yossi and thought, what's he gonna do with that beautiful Apfelstrudel? He did not disappoint. When it came to him, he took the biggest piece, he admired it, and everyone was paying attention. And he smashed it against the ruffles of his Italian shirt right under his beard and smeared it all the way down to those purple velvet hands. That was the last straw for Samuel. He got up and he turned to Yossi and he said, "Yossi, I invited you here because you had the reputation of being a wise man, and I expected you to teach us something or to tell us a story. And instead, you have been acting absolutely like an idiot." Well, Yossi, his eyes got big, and he got up slowly from his chair, and he turned to Samuel and he said, "Samuel, when I arrived here in the clothes of a poor beggar, and you turned me away, and then when I came back in the clothes of a fine wealthy man and you invited me in, I realized that you did not care about me. You cared about my fine clothes." And I thought to myself, why should I eat your fine food? I'll feed it to the fine clothes instead. up his cup of tea, and he poured it into his other coat pocket, and he patted it, and he said, "Drink well, my cousin." And he picked up that mahogany walking stick with the gold ball on top, and he walked out the door. The next morning, Yossi was back in Stedena, and he was sitting at his breakfast table, and he was munching on his little dry crust of bread. That was his breakfast. When his wife, I don't know why she wasn't eating with him, but she came into the room and she was sweeping again. She liked to sweep. And she swept her right up over in front of the table there, and she said, "Yossi, was I right about the clothes?" Now, Yossi really truly was a wise man, and you husbands know this when you realize that he did not say a word back to her. He smiled, and he got up from the table, and he reached out, and he took the broom from his wife. And he danced a little jig with the broom. And he held it out at arm's length, and he said, "You know, we could dress this broomstick up, and it would look as fine as the best dressed person I saw in Budapest yesterday." Then he winked at his wife, and he said, "You know, fools only look at people's clothes. The wise also see their souls." That's the wise shoemaker from Stedena. Any comments? Could you hear that there? Uh-oh, he fell asleep. Let's not wake him up. We could stop now, or I have one little story. Can we make it for another, like 8 minutes? Got some nods, good. I'm going to take that as affirmation. Thank you. I'll break it up with a wise saying. A holy man was asked once, "What is forgiveness?" And his answer was, "It is the fragrance that flowers give when they are crushed." And that's kind of a hard thing, but it's, I think, a valid metaphor for what it means to be a suffering servant, what it means to be a follower of Christ. We recognize that pain is not the worst thing, suffering is not the worst thing that can happen to us, and that it can bring out really important parts of the development of our spiritual lives. Okay, so the holy man was asked, "What is forgiveness?" And his response was, "It is the fragrance that flowers give when they are crushed." And I have to say, when I am crushed, and I get crushed once in a while, literally, I'm a mechanic, and there's heavy stuff, and there are wrenches, and I smash my fingers. And I have to tell you, it's not always fragrance that comes out when that happens. But we are here to encourage each other and to develop an insight that is fragrant and that comes out when we are crushed, metaphorically and literally. There was a man, and he was hungry one morning, and he lived in the jungle. And so he went out looking for something to eat, this way and that way down the path. And he wasn't finding anything, but he did hear a twig snap. And he looked back through the leaves and he saw orange and black stripes. And he was a wise man. He knew that was a tiger. And he realized the tiger was out looking for his breakfast too. And he picked up the pace. And the tiger did too. And pretty soon he was running through the forest as fast as he could possibly go. And the tiger was bounding behind him and closing the gap really fast. He was going as fast as he could when he burst through a little clearing. And whoa! Right there he was at the edge of a precipice. And there was nowhere to go. And he only had a split second to make a decision. And the tiger was launching himself to get him. And he realized from the limb of a Himalayan oak tree, a thick vine hung down, and it was out just a little further than he could actually reach. So he jumped over the precipice and grabbed the vine and slid down about 6 feet. And hung there, panting. And the tiger came to a skidding halt and was not deterred. He was right there, and the tiger was reaching out as far as he could with his big old paw, trying to reel him in, because he was hungry. And he knew the man would taste very good. Well, for the moment, he couldn't reach. And the man was hanging there, and he was relieved, and he caught his breath. And then he decided to assess the situation. He looked down. This is not a good idea when you're in heights like that. And he saw that it was a very long way to the bottom. And not just that, his vine didn't even reach halfway. And furthermore, there was another tiger way down there, and the ruckus had alerted it to something, and it was looking up at him, and it was swishing its tail, and it was looking up at him, and it was licking its chops, because it was pretty sure there might be some breakfast in store for it. Well, that didn't look like a good way of escape. So he looked around at the cliff wall, and it was a smooth cliff wall. There were no toe holds and no finger holds at all. Didn't look like he was going to get away that way. So he followed the vine up with his eyes and saw, well, at least it was wrapped around very sturdy and securely on this oak branch. But then he saw a little movement. He saw a little mouse on that branch, and it was white as day. And it came walking up that branch, and it stopped right where his vine went around the branch. And it sniffed it, and it wiggled its little nose, and it took a little bite. It went chomp, and took a tiny mouse bite out of his vine. And he was like, huh? But then it turned around, and it went back. And as soon as it got back to the big oak tree, another mouse, this one as black as night, walked out that branch, sniffed, and took another bite right beside the white mouse vine. And they just kept tag teaming like that, on and on. He shouted up at them, hey, that's my vine you're nibbling on. But they didn't understand English. So they didn't listen. They kept right on going. There he was, the mice biting, bite after bite. The tiger trying to get the vine, the other one swishing his tail. He turned his attention to the sheer wall because that was the most comforting thing he had left. And this time he noticed something he hadn't the first time he looked at it. There was a tiny little crevasse, and some dust had blown into that crevasse. And a little bit of rain had trickled down, and it made like a little pot of soil. And a seed had fallen in there, and there was one plant growing out of that. It was a wild strawberry plant. And he remembered that he still had not found his breakfast, and he was terribly hungry. So he reached up on that line, and he stretched out his hand as far as he could go, and he did a little rocking motion, and all of a sudden he could get his finger and his thumb on the one little red strawberry. It was ripe. It was the size of the end of my little finger here. And he plucked it and very carefully brought it to his mouth, and he squished it with his tongue. And it was the sweetest, tartest, best strawberry he had ever tasted in his entire life. And that's where that Dallas story ends. Because those people believe that the audience participated in stories, and the audience finishes that story. This would be a good time to talk about the expected arc of stories in the West. It wouldn't it? That's an Eastern story for you right there. We expect the story arc to start with a protagonist. Good, we know that, somebody we can identify with. And we expect that protagonist to have desire. They're hungry. They feel romantic. They want some money, or whatever it is. We get that, because that's us. And then we realize there's going to be obstacles. The girl's father is an obstacle. Yeah, right. And you fathers of daughters know this. You pour your life into your daughter, and you give her all the important things, and she loves you, right? And then some pimply little guy comes along from the next church over, and your daughter just goes away with him. And just see you, Dad, thanks. If they remember. I feel for Dad so much. Oh, it's a hard thing, isn't it? It's heart-wrenching. It's a story that we can relate to. So we strive, our protagonist strives for something. And then there's two options. There are two options because it wouldn't be worth our while if there weren't two options. He can be successful or she. And the story becomes, in literary terms, a comedy. Something that ends with resolution, with a marriage, with hopefulness, and with success. Or, because it's real life, and we want stories that are real, it can end in failure, in tragedy. That's what we expect. And it is really an arc that comes out of our Christian worldview. Our lives have meaning, and what our choices matter, and who we get advice from matters. And our outcome is important, because we're not nihilists. What we do matters, and we will not completely end existing when we die here. So there are different ways to tell stories. And it took me more than 5 years to understand that wild strawberry story. And you know what? Life is uncertain, so I'm going to give you some clues, and then we're going to go eat. First clue is, I figured it out. And that black mouse and that white mouse, they've taken almost 25,000 bites each out of my vine. And I don't know which day the vine's going to go slurp, down, down, down. But I know I'm not likely to get out of this world alive. And when I was young, I felt invincible and immortal. I would throw myself into things I would never do now because I just didn't believe I could die. You know the feeling if you're youngish and you remember back. Now that I'm old, that I've experienced the bag of dry sticks, now that I have watched my sister come this close to dying of AIDS, I feel in my bones, in the marrow of my bones, my mortality. And it changes everything. I know now that this Scrabble game that I'm playing with my sister and my mom, as beautiful it is, one day that will be the last Scrabble game. I know that this wonderful meal I'm having, one day that will be the last wonderful meal. And it changes it. It makes everything I do holy and beautiful and something that I love and am grateful for, and it makes my life different. So, my advice is live in the present. You've heard that from every person who's talked already here. Enjoy those beautiful things that God has given you now, knowing that there's a limited supply and that you are blessed. And in being grateful, you will become holy and you will become naturally righteous towards God. Thank you for listening carefully, and may you have beautiful wild strawberries in your experience. So, I've done. Do you want to say something?
Has anybody got something to share? That was powerful, that's something to share from your storytelling. So thank you very much, LeRoy. Anybody want to just open it up? It's got me speechless. Thank you. That's good. Thank you. Dinner at 12 o'clock.
You're welcome to accost me at any time. I enjoy talking about storytelling, and I assure you I want all of you to be affirmed in your ability to tell stories. So this is not about entertaining only. It is about showing you, and I hope to do more of that, how you are storytellers and how you will direct and change the world by paying attention to those skills that God has given every human being, even people who don't read and can't talk anymore. They tell stories. I'm done.